Death was never the exit. It was a perception shift. Here's what they don't tell you about death, and what I discovered by accident that changed everything I thought I knew about consciousness itself. You were raised to believe that death is the moment the door closes, the final exit, the absolute boundary between existence and void. But what if I told you the door was never shut to begin with? What if the only thing that changes at death is that you finally stop pretending the door was ever closed? Robert Monroe didn't set out to prove anything about death. He was a successful radio executive, grounded in the practical world of business and technology. But in 1958, something happened that shattered his entire understanding of reality. He began having spontaneous out-of-body experiences, moments where his consciousness would simply lift out of his physical form and float, fully aware, fully coherent, completely independent of his body lying motionless below. The first time it happened, he was terrified. Imagine the shock. You're lying in bed, fully awake, and suddenly you're looking down at your own body from the ceiling. Your heart is still beating. Your chest is still rising and falling. But you, the awareness, the observer, the experiencer, are somewhere else entirely. This wasn't a dream. Monroe could see details he later verified: the position of objects in the room, sounds from outside, even information he couldn't have known from his physical vantage point. He underwent extensive medical testing. Neurologists, psychiatrists, sleep specialists all found nothing wrong. His brain was healthy. His body was functioning normally. Yet the experiences continued, growing stronger, more controlled, more undeniable. And that's when Monroe realized something that would become the foundation of decades of research. Consciousness doesn't exit the body at death because it was never fully contained by it in the first place. Think about that carefully. We've been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding. We've assumed that awareness is generated by the brain, housed in the skull, dependent on neural firing for its existence. But Monroe's experiences suggested something radically different. The body is not a generator of consciousness. It's a receiving station. Like a radio doesn't create the music, it merely tunes into frequencies already broadcasting through space. Your brain doesn't create your awareness, it focuses it. It narrows it down to a single bandwidth we call physical reality. And death is simply what happens when the receiver stops functioning. The broadcast continues. The signal remains. You just stop decoding it through that particular instrument. Monroe began testing this systematically. He taught himself to induce the separation state at will, documenting every detail with the precision of a scientist. He recorded hundreds of out-of-body experiences, noting the sensations, the environments, the entities he encountered. And he discovered something both unsettling and liberating. The boundaries you think define you, the edges of your skin, the limits of your skull, the beginning and end of your physical form, these are perceptual constructs, not actual barriers. In his journeys, Monroe found that he could move through walls, travel vast distances instantaneously, perceive locations he had never physically visited. He could observe scenes unfolding in real time, gather information, and return to his body to verify what he had seen. The data checked out. Again and again, the information he brought back from these non-physical excursions proved accurate. But here's where it gets truly profound. Monroe realized that this ability to exist independent of the body wasn't unique to him. It wasn't a special gift or paranormal talent. It was fundamental to consciousness itself. Every human being, he discovered, already does this. We just don't remember it. When you sleep, your consciousness loosens its grip on physical focus. It drifts into other levels, other frequencies of experience. Most people dismiss these as mere dreams, random neural noise. But Monroe found that with training, you could remain aware during this transition. You could consciously navigate the spaces between waking and sleeping, between physical and non-physical, between embodied and free. This is what death is. It's not a transition into nothingness. It's a transition into a mode of existence you've already been experiencing your entire life. You just haven't recognized it. Every night when you sleep, you practice dying. You release your grip on the physical form. You drift into non-physical perception. And then, when you wake, you return. The difference between sleep and death is simple. In death, you don't come back to the same receiver. The body stops functioning as a focusing mechanism. But the awareness, your identity, your continuity of self, that remains intact, uninterrupted, merely shifty. NG to a different frequency band. Monroe spent decades verifying this, not just through his own experiences, but through the thousands of research subjects who came to the Monroe Institute. People from every background, engineers, doctors, skeptics, scientists, all reported the same core phenomenon. Awareness continues beyond the body. Identity persists without physical form. Consciousness operates on principles far broader than neural chemistry. And this leads to the question that should be keeping you up at night. What if you've already died and simply chosen to keep perceiving this particular bandwidth? What if physical reality is just one channel among many, and you're so habituated to this frequency that you've forgotten how to change the dial? Monroe's early terror transformed into understanding. The fear of death, he realized, is not the fear of ending. It's the fear of the unknown. And the moment you experience conscious separation, the moment you exit your body voluntarily and return, the unknown becomes familiar. Death loses its power because you've already practiced it. You've already proven to yourself that awareness doesn't need a brain to exist. This isn't metaphor. This isn't philosophy. This is Monroe's lived, documented, replicated testimony. You are not your body, you never were. The body is a vehicle you're temporarily inhabiting, a focusing lens through which a far vaster consciousness experiences physical density. And when that lens shatters, when the body finally stops functioning, you don't vanish. You simply stop broadcasting on one channel and naturally shift to the next available frequency. The door was never closed. You've just been staring at the wall. What was revealed next shocked even Monroe, because it meant death wasn't just survival, it was relocation to a geography of consciousness that operates on entirely different principles than physical space. Monroe didn't speculate about the afterlife. He didn't theorize or philosophize. He mapped it. With the same methodical precision he had applied to building radio stations, he began charting the territories of non-physical reality. He discovered that consciousness beyond the body isn't formless chaos. It has structure, it has levels, it has distinct environments with their own characteristics, rules, and inhabitants, and he gave them names not to mystify but to categorize focus levels. Each focus represents a different frequency band of consciousness, a different vibrational state accessible through specific techniques. Local II became his primary domain of exploration. This is the region you enter immediately upon leaving physical focus, a non-physical zone where thought becomes structure, where emotion shapes landscape, where time no longer flows in a linear sequence, but bends, loops, and intersects like light refracting through water. Monroe described his first sustained entry into local II as both exhilarating and disorienting. The moment he fully detached from physical sensation, he found himself in an environment that felt real, solid, tangible, coherent, but operated on completely different physics. He could move by intention alone. He could shape his surroundings through focused thought. He encountered structures built from belief, landscapes formed from collective expectation, entire cities constructed from the mental patterns of beings no longer tied to bodies. And here's where it gets unsettling. Many of the entities Monroe met in local II didn't realize they were dead. They were still perceiving reality through the lens of physical expectation. They saw bodies, their own bodies, because they believed they should have bodies. They inhabited familiar environments, houses, streets, rooms, because they couldn't yet conceive of existence without physical location. Monroe called these stuck consciousnesses beings who had died physically but hadn't yet adjusted to the new rules of non-physical perception. He would approach them, communicate with them, and gently help them recognize their situation. "You don't have a body anymore," he would explain. "You're perceiving a thought form, a projection based on habit. You can let it go. You can move deeper into the non-physical spectrum." Some understood immediately. They released their grip on physical appearance and shifted into higher focus levels, shedding identity structures tied to the life they'd just left. Others resisted, clinging to the familiar, unable or unwilling to accept that the rules had changed. This revealed something critical about death. It's not an automatic enlightenment. It's not an instant transformation into omniscience. You carry your beliefs, your habits, your expectations into the next level. If you die believing you need a body to exist, you'll project one. If you die believing you'll be judged, you'll create an experience of judgment. If you die confused about what death is, you'll remain confused until someone or something helps you reorient. Monroe documented his navigation techniques carefully. Entering local II required achieving a specific vibrational state, a sensation he described as acceleration, like a car shifting gears. There's a feeling of lifting out of density, a moment when gravity stops making sense, when up and down become irrelevant. You don't move through space, you shift focus. You don't travel to local II, you tune into it. And here's the revelation that changes everything. You're already doing this every night. When you dream, you're in local II. When you lose yourself in deep imagination, you're brushing against its edges. When you have that inexplicable sense of being somewhere else, while your body goes through the motions, you're momentarily accessing this non-physical bandwidth. The difference is that most people have been conditioned to dismiss these experiences as unreal, as mere neural activity, as the brain processing data. But Monroe found that with practice, you could remain fully conscious during the transition. You could enter local II deliberately, explore it methodically, gather information, and return with clear memories. And what he discovered there matched reports from thousands of years of mystical tradition, from near-death experiences, from shamanic journeys, from every culture that ever developed practices for navigating non-physical reality. Local II isn't uniform. It has regions. Some areas are populated by beings who recently transitioned from physical form. Others are inhabited by consciousnesses who chose to remain in non-physical reality permanently, evolving through layers of identity without ever returning to a body. Still, other zones are collaborative spaces, meeting grounds where physical and non-physical consciousness interact, often without the physical person remembering the encounter upon waking. Monroe encountered his deceased friends in local II. He had conversations with them, verified details about their deaths, received information that he later confirmed with living relatives. These weren't vague, symbolic interactions. They were coherent exchanges, complete with personality quirks, memories, and specific knowledge only the deceased person would have known. And they all said the same thing: death is not darkness, it's not void, it's not nothingness, it's relief. It's the sudden absence of physical density, the lightness of being unencumbered by a body's limitations. Most described it as deeply familiar, like returning home after a long journey, remembering a state they had known before birth and temporarily forgotten during physical life. Monroe also discovered something unsettling about time in local II. Past, present, and future exist simultaneously. Events don't unfold sequentially. They exist as simultaneous probabilities that you can observe from different angles. He could perceive scenes from his own childhood, moments from his future, and alternate versions of events that never materialized in physical reality, but existed as viable potentials in non-physical space. This means that when you die and shift into local II, you're not entering some distant realm. You're entering a layer of reality that has always been here, always been accessible, always been humming just beneath the surface of physical perception. The body simply acted as a filter, narrowing your awareness to a single timeline, a single location, a single stream of sensory input. Remove that filter, and the full spectrum becomes available. Death, in Monroe's model, is simply the permanent activation of this wider perception. You don't go anywhere. You stop limiting yourself to one narrow band. And the moment that limitation lifts, you realize you've been in locale II all along. You just couldn't see it while anchored in physical density. The practical implication is staggering. If you're already traveling to locale II every night in sleep, then death is just what happens when you stop coming back to the same physical anchor. The journey itself isn't new. The destination isn't foreign. You've been practicing the transition your entire life without realizing it. Monroe's message is clear. Death is relocation, not annihilation. It's a change of address within consciousness, not a cancellation of existence. And the proof isn't waiting for you on the other side. It's available right now, tonight, every time you close your eyes and drift into sleep. You're just not trained to remember the trip. Here's where Monroe's research dismantles the deepest illusion. You think you are your body, but what if your body is just a temporary interface you're wearing, and you've forgotten how to take it off? Monroe had a term for it, the I there. It's the larger identity that exists beyond physical form, the broader consciousness that observes and experiences through multiple focal points simultaneously. And understanding the I there changes everything about how you perceive death. Imagine you're wearing a virtual reality headset, fully immersed. The graphics are flawless, the sensations convincing, the storyline engaging. After hours inside, you forget you're wearing a device. You start identifying completely with the character on screen. You believe you are that character. And then someone taps you on the shoulder and says, "You can take the headset off now." That moment of recognition, that sudden remembering that you were never actually confined to the simulation, is what Monroe experienced every time he left his body. He would float above his physical form and look down, and there it was. His body, still breathing, still functioning, completely fine without his conscious attention focused on it. The body didn't need him to continue operating. It had its own intelligence, its own autonomic systems, its own rhythms. His awareness, the part he identified as I, was completely independent. It could observe the body. It could return to the body. It could animate the body. But it wasn't generated by the body. This realization shattered everything. If awareness persists when separated from the body, if perception continues without neural substrate, if identity remains coherent without sensory input, then the body isn't the source of consciousness. It's a focusing mechanism, a reduction tool, a device that narrows vast, multidimensional awareness into a single point of experience. Monroe began exploring this systematically. He practiced remaining detached from his physical form for extended periods, observing how the body functioned without his attention. He discovered that the body has its own consciousness, a biological intelligence that manages heartbeat, digestion, immune response, cellular repair, all without requiring conscious oversight. You don't think your heart into beating. You don't calculate the chemical reactions in your liver. The body knows how to sustain itself. What you are, the perceiver, the experiencer, the continuity of awareness, is something else entirely. You're the operator, not the machine. And death, in this framework, is simply what happens when the operator steps out of the machine permanently. Monroe called this larger identity the I, there because it exists there, beyond physical focus, outside time-space constraints, observing all focal points simultaneously. You, the personality reading this, are one expression of the I there. You're a localized focus of a far vaster consciousness that has chosen to narrow its perception into a single life, a single body, a single timeline. And here's the part that should change how you see everything. The I there doesn't die when the body dies. It simply closes one focal point and continues experiencing through others. Monroe encountered his own I there during his explorations. He described it as both humbling and liberating, meeting a version of himself that existed outside time, observing all his incarnations at once, aware of every choice, every experience, every life path he had explored or would explore. The I there was patient, vast, amused by the small concerns of physical identity. It saw the life Monroe was living as one thread in a much larger tapestry. This reframed death completely. If you're a temporary focus of something larger, then the fear of annihilation is misplaced. You can't annihilate the I there. You can only close one perspective, one lens, one experiential thread. The larger identity continues, integrating the experiences of the life that just ended, absorbing the lessons, the emotions, the growth, and moving on to the next focal point. Monroe's research subjects reported the same phenomenon. People who successfully achieved deep out-of-body states described encountering a broader version of themselves, an identity that felt utterly familiar yet far more expansive than their physical personality. Some called it the higher self. Others called it the oversoul. Monroe called it the I, there because it transcended the dualistic separation between here and there, self and other, physical and non-physical. And this is the practical takeaway. If the body is just a suit you stepped into, then death is simply the act of stepping back out. The suit stops moving. The suit deteriorates. But you, the one who wore the suit, the one who chose to experience physical density through that particular form, remain intact, continuous, uninterrupted. Monroe found that people who had consciously experienced separation from their bodies lost their fear of death almost immediately. Why? Because once you've directly verified that awareness persists beyond physical form, once you've looked down at your body from outside and realized you're still coherent, still thinking, still perceiving, death becomes obvious. It's not an ending, it's a wardrobe change. Think about the last time you took off a heavy coat after wearing it for hours. The moment of relief, the lightness, the sudden freedom of movement. That's how Monroe's research subjects described death, not as loss but as release. The body was a necessary constraint for navigating physical reality, but it came with limitations: pain, aging, fatigue, sensory restriction. Stepping out of it felt like taking off a weighted suit after a long dive. This doesn't diminish the value of physical life. The body isn't a prison. It's a sophisticated instrument for experiencing a specific range of frequencies. But it's temporary, and recognizing its temporary nature removes the terror of losing it. You wouldn't mourn the loss of a rental car once the trip is over. You'd return it, assess the journey, and move on to the next mode of transport. Monroe's final insight on this: the fear of death is actually the fear of losing yourself. But what if the self you're afraid of losing is just a role you're playing? What if your true identity, the I, there, the continuity of awareness, the experiencer beyond form, has never been threatened by physical death, because it was never confined to physical parameters in the first place? The body is a suit. You stepped into it at birth. You'll step out of it at death. But the one doing the stepping, that's you, and that part never stops existing. It just changes perspective. What Monroe discovered next was perhaps the most verifiable, repeatable evidence that death is a frequency shift, not an ending. And it starts with a sensation you might have already felt without knowing what it was. Before every out-of-body experience, Monroe felt it: the vibrational state, a deep, resonant hum coursing through his entire body, a feeling of being shaken loose from matter itself. It wasn't painful. It wasn't frightening once he understood it. It was simply the sensation of consciousness beginning to detach from physical focus, like a spacecraft releasing from its docking station. This wasn't mystical. It wasn't metaphorical. It was physical, or at least, it felt physical in the moment, even though it signaled a transition beyond physicality. And here's what makes this groundbreaking: Monroe found a way to induce this state reliably, repeatedly, in thousands of people. He developed what became known as hemisync technology, audio patterns using binaural beats to synchronize the left and right brain hemispheres. When your brain enters specific frequency states, theta, delta, certain gamma patterns, a perception begins to decouple from sensory anchors. You remain conscious, but your awareness is no longer tethered to the body's sensory data stream. This is the vibrational state, and it's proof that consciousness operates on frequency, not location. When you die, you don't go anywhere. You don't travel to some distant realm. You shift octaves. The body can no longer hold the lower frequency band, so awareness naturally rises to the next available vibration. It's like how water turns to steam when it reaches a certain temperature. The H2O molecules don't vanish. They simply change state, entering a less dense, more expansive form. Monroe documented this transition exhaustively. He described the vibrational state as coming in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes intense. It often began at the edges of sleep, that liminal space between waking and unconsciousness, but with practice he could trigger it at will. The key was relaxation combined with focused intention. The body had to be still, the mind alert but not rigid. And then, like tuning a radio, you would feel the shift. First a tingling, then a buzzing, then a deep, rhythmic pulsation that seemed to move through every cell. Some people described it as feeling like they were plugged into an electrical current. Others said it felt like being inside a vibrating cocoon. Monroe simply called it the vibrational state, the energetic signature of consciousness preparing to separate from physical density. And here's the critical discovery. The moment of death produces the exact same energetic signature. Near-death experiences report it. Mystics describe it. Monroe's research subjects who reached deep separation states confirmed it. The transition out of the body, whether voluntary or permanent, follows the same pattern: vibrational acceleration, a sense of lifting, the sensation of passing through a threshold, and then release. Expansion, lightness, freedom from the gravitational pull of physical form. The only difference between an out-of-body experience and death is that in the OBE you maintain a connection to the body. There's a thread, a link, an energetic tether that allows return. In death, that thread dissolves. The body shuts down permanently, but the transition itself, identical. This is why Monroe's work is so revolutionary. He didn't ask people to believe in an afterlife. He gave them a protocol to experience the transition before death, so they could verify for themselves that awareness persists, that identity continues, that consciousness shifts rather than ends. Thousands of Monroe Institute participants have gone through this process. Engineers, doctors, skeptics, atheists, people who came with zero belief in anything beyond material reality. And they left shaken not by fear but by recognition. They had directly experienced their own consciousness operating independent of neural firing. They had perceived environments without sensory organs. They had remained coherent, thinking, aware, while their bodies lay motionless in a controlled environment. The data was undeniable. Consciousness doesn't collapse when the brain stops. It shifts frequency. Monroe's hemisync technology works by creating interference patterns between two slightly different audio tones played in each ear. Your brain perceives a third tone, the binaural beat, which isn't actually in the sound itself, but is generated by the brain trying to reconcile the difference. This third tone can be calibrated to specific frequencies that correspond to altered states: deep relaxation, theta sleep, out-of-body readiness. When the brain hemispheres synchronize through these patterns, something shifts. The usual dominance of left brain analytical processing quiets. The right hemisphere's spatial, intuitive awareness amplifies, and in that balanced state, perception becomes untethered from sensory limitation. You start perceiving beyond the body's receptor range. This is the mechanics of death laid bare. When the body fails through age, illness, trauma, it can no longer maintain the frequency required to anchor consciousness in physical density. So consciousness does what it naturally does: it rises. It shifts to the next available vibration. And because you've been practicing this shift every night in sleep, because the vibrational state is already familiar to your deeper awareness. The transition isn't violent or disorienting. It's intuitive. Monroe often said that death is only frightening because we've been conditioned to see it as catastrophic. But once you've experienced the vibrational state, once you've felt yourself lift out of density while remaining fully aware, death becomes obvious. It's not annihilation. It's tuning out of a frequency you no longer need. The practical application is profound. You can train for death the same way you train for any other skill. You can familiarize yourself with the vibrational state. You can practice conscious separation. You can verify through direct experience that awareness persists beyond the body. And when physical death finally comes, it won't be a leap into the unknown. It will be a transition you've already practiced countless times. Monroe's legacy isn't comfort, it's evidence. Replicable, experiential, verifiable evidence that consciousness shifts, not ends. And the proof isn't waiting for you on the other side. It's available right now, tonight, in the space between waking and sleep, if you're willing to pay attention to the vibrations. What Monroe discovered next was so specific, so structured, that it demolished the idea that death leads to chaos, because he found the exact location where consciousness arrives immediately after physical death, and he learned how to navigate there while still alive. He called it Focus 27, the park, the reception area for the newly dead. Monroe didn't stumble into this by accident. Through years of systematic exploration, he mapped the gradients of consciousness beyond physical reality. He identified distinct focus levels, each representing a different vibrational frequency, a different bandwidth of perception accessible through specific mental states. Focus 27 sits at the threshold between physical and fully non-physical reality. It's designed, and yes, Monroe used that word deliberately, to ease the shock of no longer having a body. When you die, when you fully separate from physical form, you don't immediately realize you're dead. You still perceive something that feels like a body, something that feels like location, something that resembles the physical world you just left. Because belief shapes experience in non-physical reality, and most people die still believing they need a body, still expecting to exist somewhere. Focus 27 accommodates that expectation. It's a transitional zone, what Monroe described as Earth-like but subtly malleable. The environments there feel familiar, parks, gardens, buildings, landscapes, but they respond to thought in ways physical matter doesn't. Want a door? It appears. Need a bridge? It forms. The space itself is collaborative, shaped by the collective expectations of the consciousnesses inhabiting it. Monroe spent extensive time exploring Focus 27, documenting what he found there. He encountered people who had just died, some recently, some decades ago in linear time, though time doesn't operate the same way in these regions. He spoke with them. He observed their adjustment process. And what he learned redefined his understanding of death entirely. Many newly transitioned beings don't immediately realize they've died. They perceive a body because they expect one. They see familiar surroundings because their consciousness is still filtering experience through the lens of physical expectation. Some wander in confusion, trying to interact with the physical world, unable to understand why living people don't respond to them. Others recognize their situation quickly and move deeper into the non-physical spectrum, shedding the need for body perception and location-based identity. But Focus 27 serves a critical function. It's where guides meet the newly dead, beings who have already transitioned, who understand the nature of non-physical reality, who choose to remain in these regions to assist others through the adjustment process. Monroe encountered these guides frequently. They were patient, knowledgeable, deeply compassionate. They helped disoriented consciousnesses recognize their new state, release their grip on physical habits, and begin exploring the broader spectrum available to them. He also discovered something unexpected. Not everyone moves through Focus 27 quickly. Some linger. They're not trapped, Monroe was clear on this. They're choosing to remain in a familiar feeling environment while they process the life they just lived. They review, they reflect, they integrate, and when they're ready, they move on to deeper levels of focus, areas Monroe could barely articulate because they operated on principles so foreign to physical logic that language failed him. Monroe began conducting what he called retrieval work, deliberately traveling to Focus 27 to assist consciousnesses who were stuck in confusion or fear. He would locate them, communicate with them, help them recognize that they were no longer physical. Sometimes they were recent deaths, disoriented by sudden accidents. Other times they were people who had died decades ago but remained in a loop, replaying the same patterns, unable to break free from the habits of their physical life. One of Monroe's most documented retrievals involved a man who had died in World War II. He was still perceiving a battlefield, still convinced he was fighting, still trapped in the mental loop of his final moments. Monroe approached him, spoke to him, gradually helped him recognize that the war was over, that his body had died, that he could release the trauma and move forward. The moment of recognition was profound. The man's entire demeanor shifted. The battlefield dissolved. He saw Focus 27 clearly for the first time. The park, the guides, the other transitioned beings, and he wept with relief. This is what Monroe meant when he said death is not exile, it's homecoming. The people he encountered in Focus 27, once they adjusted to their new state, almost universally described the same thing: relief, the absence of physical density, the lightness of being unencumbered, the sudden remembering of something vast and familiar that had been temporarily forgotten during physical life. But Focus 27 also revealed something sobering: your beliefs matter. If you die convinced you'll be judged, you'll create an experience of judgment in Focus 27. If you die believing you'll be punished, you'll manifest that punishment until you recognize it's self-created. If you die clinging to physical identity, you'll remain in body perception until you're ready to let it go. The environment responds to consciousness. It mirrors back what you project. This is why Monroe emphasized the importance of preparation. Death isn't automatic enlightenment. It's a transition into a state where thought has immediate creative power, where belief shapes environment, where unresolved patterns play out until you recognize and release them. If you approach death with fear, confusion, and rigid expectations, you'll experience fear, confusion, and rigid environments until someone like Monroe or a guide or your own deeper awareness helps you shift perspective. But if you approach death with understanding, with the recognition that you're shifting frequency rather than ending, with an awareness that the body was always temporary, then Focus 27 becomes what it was designed to be: a brief rest stop, a place to orient yourself, a launching pad into deeper exploration of consciousness. Monroe's final insight on Focus 27: it's not waiting for you after death. It exists right now, accessible through the same techniques that allow out-of-body exploration. You can visit it. You can meet the guides. You can familiarize yourself with the territory. And when physical death finally comes, you won't be entering the unknown. You'll be returning to a place you've already scouted, already understood, already made peace with. Death in Monroe's map is not exile, it's navigation. And Focus 27 is the first landmark on a journey that doesn't end, it only deepens. Here's where Monroe's work shatters the illusion of isolated selfhood entirely. Because what he discovered is that you're not one consciousness, you're a focal point in a cluster of consciousnesses, all expressing a single greater identity across multiple lives, multiple timelines, multiple realities simultaneously. This is the I-there cluster, and understanding it changes everything about how you process death. Monroe's terminology was deliberate. He didn't call it the higher self or the soul because those terms carry too much baggage, too many religious connotations. He called it the I, there because it exists there, beyond physical time, beyond individual incarnation, beyond the limiting identity structure you think of as you. Imagine a tree. Each branch is a separate life, a separate focal point of consciousness experiencing reality through a different form, a different timeline, a different probability stream. But all the branches grow from the same trunk, all draw from the same root system. All are expressions of a single living entity. You, the personality reading this, the individual identity you wake up with every morning, are one branch, one focal point, one localized expression of a far vaster consciousness that is simultaneously experiencing reality through multiple perspectives. Monroe encountered his own I there during deep non-physical exploration. He described the experience as both humbling and exhilarating. He found himself in contact with a version of himself that existed outside linear time, observing all his lives at once, past lives, future lives, parallel probability lives, all happening simultaneously from the I there's perspective. And the I there was amused, not condescending, but gently entertained by the small concerns of physical identity. From that vantage point, the life Monroe was living as a 20th century radio executive was just one thread in a vast tapestry. The I there had lived as a farmer in medieval Europe, a sailor in ancient Greece, a teacher in 23rd century Earth, a completely non-human consciousness on another planetary system, all simultaneously, all feeding experience back to the central cluster. This isn't reincarnation in the traditional sense. Reincarnation implies a linear sequence. You live one life, you die, you wait, you're reborn into the next life. But Monroe found that from the I there's perspective, all lives exist at once. Linear time is a perceptual artifact of physical reality. Beyond the body, past, present, and future are simultaneous probability fields that the I there observes and experiences through multiple focal points. So what happens when you die? The focal point you identify as you closes. The individual personality, the specific life you lived, the collection of experiences you accumulated in this particular incarnation, all of that gets reabsorbed into the I there cluster. Your memories don't vanish. Your identity doesn't dissolve, but it integrates back into the larger whole, becoming part of the cumulative knowledge, the expanded awareness, the growing complexity of the I there itself. Think of it like this: you're an actor playing a role in a film. While you're in character, you fully embody that personality, that life, that set of circumstances. But when the scene ends, when the director calls cut, you step out of character. You don't cease to exist. You return to your broader identity as the actor, integrating the experience of the role you just played, carrying those emotional textures, those insights, those lessons forward into the next performance. Death is the director calling cut. You step out of character. The I there integrates the role you just played. And then, if the I there chooses, it focuses into a new role, a new life, a new focal point through which to experience reality. But here's the critical part Monroe emphasized. The I there never dies. It can't die. It exists beyond the temporal constraints that make death possible. Individual focal points open and close like blossoms on a tree. They bloom, they experience, they wither, they fall, but the tree itself continues uninterrupted, generating new blooms, new focal points, new expressions of its fundamental identity. This reframes grief entirely. When someone you love dies, you're not losing them permanently. You're witnessing the closing of one focal point while the larger I, their part of, continues. And if you share a deep connection with them, if your I there cluster and theirs are intertwined, you'll meet again in other lives, other forms, other focal points. The relationship isn't ended. It's paused while both of you integrate this particular round of experience. Monroe encountered people in non-physical reality who recognized him from other lives. Not past lives in a linear sense, but parallel lives, simultaneous expressions of overlapping I there clusters. They shared memories of experiences together that Monroe, in his current focal point, had no conscious awareness of. But when he shifted into broader I there perspective, he could access those memories, verify those connections, understand the web of relationships that extended far beyond his singular lifetime. This also explains something that's puzzled people for millennia. Why do some individuals feel ancient? Why do children sometimes display knowledge or skills they couldn't have learned in their current life? Because they're not just this life. They're a focal point of an I there that has accumulated experience across countless incarnations. Sometimes that broader knowledge bleeds through, momentarily accessible before the filters of physical identity reassert themselves. The practical takeaway is this: if you're a focal point of an I there cluster, then your death isn't the end of you. It's the closing of one perspective, one lens, one experiential thread. But the continuity, the awareness that has been accumulating experience through all your focal points, all your lives, all your expressions, that never ends. It simply shifts attention to other aspects of itself, other lives it's simultaneously living, other branches of the same tree. Monroe's research subjects who experienced deep I there contact reported the same phenomenon, a sense of vast relief. The fear of personal annihilation dissolved because they recognized they were never as small, as singular, as isolated as they believed. They were always part of something larger, something continuous, something that couldn't be threatened by physical death. And here's the final insight: you don't have to wait for death to access either perspective. Monroe taught techniques for consciously connecting with your broader identity, for glimpsing the other focal points, for understanding the larger pattern of your existence. It requires stillness. It requires releasing rigid identification with your current personality. But it's accessible right now, while you're still embodied. Death will return you to either perspective automatically. But why wait? Why not practice the shift now? Familiarize yourself with the broader identity you're already part of, and remove the fear of losing something you were never confined to in the first place. You were never singular, you were always a cluster, and clusters don't die, they just reorganize their focal points. What Monroe uncovered next challenges one of the most persistent spiritual beliefs across nearly every tradition, because he found that reincarnation isn't a cosmic law, it's a choice. And some consciousnesses graduate from the cycle entirely. In Focus 27 and beyond, Monroe encountered beings who had no intention of returning to physical reality. They had lived their physical lives, integrated their experiences, and moved on to explore dimensions that have nothing to do with bodies, planets, or time-space as we understand it. This shattered the assumption that death automatically leads to rebirth. It doesn't. The decision to return to physical density depends entirely on what the I there cluster is seeking, what lessons remain unexplored, what experiences would serve its continued evolution. Some consciousnesses reincarnate rapidly. Monroe met beings in Focus 27 who had barely paused after death before diving back into physical form. They had specific patterns to refine, particular relationships to continue, precise circumstances they wanted to explore. For them, physical reality was still a rich training ground, and they returned eagerly, sometimes within months or years of their previous death. Others took long pauses. Monroe encountered consciousnesses who had rested in non-physical reality for what would be centuries in linear time. They used that interval to review their previous lives, to integrate lessons, to plan their next incarnation with meticulous care. They consulted guides. They examined probable futures. They chose specific families, specific bodies, specific life circumstances that would provide the optimal environment for the growth they were seeking. And then there were those who never came back. Monroe described meeting beings in deeper focus levels, beyond 27, in regions he struggled to articulate, who had graduated from physical reality entirely. They had extracted everything physical experience offers: the intensity of emotion, the constraints of time, the challenges of separation, the lessons of cause and effect within a material framework. And having learned those lessons, they chose to explore non-physical dimensions where entirely different principles apply. These beings weren't higher or better in a hierarchical sense. They had simply moved on, like a student graduating from one level of education and entering another field of study entirely. Physical reality served its purpose. They absorbed its teachings, and now they were exploring consciousness in forms that don't require bodies, planets, or temporal sequence. Monroe asked them directly, why not return? Why not continue the cycle? And their answers varied, but the core message was consistent. Physical reality is optional. It's one classroom among infinite CL.S rooms, and once you've mastered its curriculum, there's no requirement to repeat it. This reframes everything about purpose and meaning. If reincarnation is a choice, then your current life isn't some karmic sentence you're forced to endure. It's an intentional exploration. Your I there cluster chose this focal point, this body, this set of circumstances, because it offered something valuable, some experience, some relationship, some challenge that would contribute to the cluster's evolving understanding of consciousness itself. And after this life, you'll assess, you'll review what was learned, what remains unresolved, what new questions have emerged. And then you'll decide, return for another round, or move on to explore something else entirely. Monroe found that the decision often depends on attachment, not in the negative sense, but in the sense of unfinished business. If you die with deep unresolved connections, relationships you're not ready to release, patterns you're still working through, questions that remain unanswered, you're more likely to choose another physical incarnation. The pull back into density is strong when there's something still calling you toward material experience. But if you complete what you came to do, if you resolve your primary relationships, integrate your core lessons, fulfill the purpose your I there cluster intended for this focal point, then the pull weakens. You might choose to rest in non-physical reality for a while, or you might move into entirely different modes of existence that Monroe could barely describe, because they operate on principles so alien to physical logic. He encountered consciousnesses who had become what he called helpers, beings who remained in non-physical reality specifically to assist others through the death transition, through Focus 27 orientation, through the integration process. They had no interest in reincarnating. Their purpose had shifted to service within the non-physical spectrum. Others had merged into what Monroe described as group identities, i.e. clusters that had become so expansive, so interconnected, that individual focal points no longer made sense. They existed as collective awareness, experiencing reality through the combined perspective of hundreds or thousands of integrated identities. Physical incarnation for them would be like trying to squeeze an ocean into a teacup, unnecessary, limiting, antithetical to the expanded state they now inhabited. This doesn't mean physical life is inferior. Monroe was clear on this. Physical reality offers something unique: the intensity of limitation, the sharpness of contrast, the focused feedback of cause and effect within a stable material framework. You can't learn certain lessons in non-physical reality because thought is too immediately creative there. Consequences are too fluid. Physical density provides the resistance, the friction, the delay between intention and outcome that allows for deep learning. But once you've learned those lessons, the choice is yours. Monroe's final insight on reincarnation: don't assume you're required to return. Examine your attachments, not to eliminate them, but to understand them. Are you still drawn toward physical experience? Do you have relationships or explorations that feel incomplete? Or are you nearing the end of your interest in material density, ready to explore consciousness through entirely different modes? Death isn't a sentence. It's a crossroads. You assess, you choose, you proceed. And whether that means another lifetime on Earth, a rest in Focus 27, or a leap into dimensions Monroe could barely map, the decision is yours, shaped by your either cluster's evolving interests and the vast spectrum of experience available across all frequencies of consciousness. The loop is optional, always has been. You've just been conditioned to believe it's mandatory. Here's what makes Monroe's work revolutionary. He didn't ask anyone to wait for death to find out what happens. He built a protocol that allows you to experience conscious separation before physical death. And once you've left your body voluntarily and returned, death loses its power entirely. For decades, the Monroe Institute has been conducting one of the most extensive, documented, replicable studies of consciousness outside the body ever undertaken. Engineers, doctors, scientists, skeptics, people who came with zero belief in anything beyond material reality, entered controlled environments, used hemisync audio guidance, and successfully left their physical forms while remaining fully conscious. And they all reported the same core findings: awareness persists beyond the body, perception expands without sensory organs, identity remains coherent without neural substrate, memory continues without brain function. This is the proof, not faith, not theory, experiential evidence. Monroe's approach was methodical. He didn't claim mystical revelation. He didn't appeal to, "Oh, ancient authority." He simply said, "Here's a technique, try it, document what you experience, verify the information you bring back," and thousands did. They would enter the out-of-body state, travel to locations they had never physically visited, observe scenes unfolding in real time, and return to their bodies to report details that were later confirmed as accurate. They described the layout of unfamiliar rooms, the contents of sealed envelopes, conversations happening in distant locations, information they couldn't have known through normal sensory channels. But the most profound impact wasn't the external verification. It was the internal shift. Once you've consciously separated from your body, once you've looked down at your physical form from outside and realized you're still thinking, still perceiving, still coherent, everything changes. Death stops being terrifying because you've already practiced it. You've already proven to yourself that awareness doesn't depend on the body, that consciousness can operate independent of neural firing, that you are not the meat and bones lying on the bed. Monroe met with dying patients who had trained in his techniques. They approached death with calm, even curiosity. They knew what was coming because they had already experienced voluntary separation. They understood that the transition would feel familiar, the vibrational state, the sensation of lifting, the release from physical density. Death wasn't a leap into the unknown. It was a shift they had practiced dozens, sometimes hundreds of times. One woman, terminally ill with cancer, came to the Monroe Institute in her final months. She learned the protocols. She practiced conscious separation. And when she returned from her first successful out-of-body experience, she was crying not from fear, but from relief. "I'm not going to die," she said. "I'm just going to leave." That distinction is everything. Dying implies annihilation. Leaving implies continuation, just in a different form, a different frequency. Monroe also documented cases of people meeting deceased loved ones during out-of-body states. Not vague symbolic encounters, but specific, verifiable exchanges. A man successfully traveled to Focus 27 and encountered his recently deceased father. They spoke. The father provided information about the location of a hidden document the family had been searching for. The man returned to his body, checked the location his father described, and found the document exactly where indicated. These aren't rare anomalies. These are consistent findings across thousands of documented experiences. The implication is staggering. If you can consciously meet deceased individuals while still alive, if you can verify information they provide, if you can interact with consciousnesses who no longer have physical bodies, then death is not a severing. It's a frequency adjustment, and communication between frequencies is possible. But Monroe's greatest legacy isn't the evidence itself. It's the accessibility of the evidence. He didn't create a system reserved for mystics or spiritual adepts. He built a protocol anyone can learn. The Monroe Institute still operates today, offering programs where ordinary people, accountants, teachers, engineers, retirees learn to leave their bodies, explore non-physical reality, and return with first-hand verification that consciousness continues. You don't need to believe, you just need to practice. And once you've directly experienced separation, once you've verified for yourself that awareness persists beyond physical form, the fear of death collapses, not because someone told you it would, but because you've already crossed the threshold and come back. Monroe's final teaching on this: the unknown only remains frightening as long as it stays unknown. The moment you explore it, the moment you familiarize yourself with the territory, it stops being a source of terror and becomes simply another domain of experience. Death was never the exit. It was always just another doorway, and you've been walking through doorways your entire life. The only difference is that this particular doorway doesn't lead back to the room you started in. It leads to a spectrum of experience you've been navigating in sleep, in altered states, in moments of deep meditation, without fully recognizing what you were doing. Monroe made it conscious. He removed the veil. He showed that the proof doesn't require dying, it requires leaving. And leaving is a skill you can develop right now, tonight, anytime you're willing to quiet the body, focus your awareness, and practice the shift. Death loses its sting the moment you realize you've already survived it, because every conscious separation is a rehearsal. Every out-of-body experience is proof, and the evidence isn't waiting for you on the other side. It's available here, now, in the space between waking and sleep, if you're willing to pay attention. Monroe didn't discover something new. He remembered something ancient. And if you're honest with yourself, you'll recognize that you already know what he proved. You've just been trained to dismiss it. Every child knows instinctively that they are more than their body. Watch how young children talk about dreams, about imaginary places, about friends no one else can see. They haven't yet been conditioned to divide reality into real and not real. They perceive the full spectrum, physical and non-physical, visible and invisible, embodied and free, without the rigid boundaries adults impose. And then we teach them to forget. We tell them dreams aren't real. We tell them imagination is just fantasy. We train them to identify completely with their physical form, to believe that the body defines the limits of their existence, to fear death as the ultimate ending. But the truth blades through anyway. Every dream where you fly, every moment of déjà vu, every inexplicable sense of familiarity with a place you've never been, a person you've never met, a skill you never learned. These are echoes of your larger nature breaking through the filters of physical identity. Monroe's work simply made these echoes conscious. He provided language, techniques, maps for navigating experiences you've already been having your entire life. You've already left your body in sleep. You just don't remember because you weren't trained to maintain awareness during the transition. You've already visited non-physical reality. You dismissed it as just a dream because you've been conditioned to believe that physical sensory data is the only valid form of perception. But dreams aren't random neural noise. They're experiences in other frequency bands, other layers of consciousness that operate on different principles than waking physical reality. Monroe proved this by remaining conscious during the transition, by documenting what he encountered, by teaching others to do the same. And what he found matched reports from every mystical tradition, every shamanic practice, every culture that developed methods for consciously navigating the spaces between waking and sleep, between physical and non-physical, between embodied and free. You already know you're more than your body. The fear of death is simply the fear of admitting it, because if you're more than your body, then you're responsible for what you do with that awareness. If consciousness continues after death, then your choices matter beyond this single lifetime. If you're a focal point of a vast I-there cluster, then you're accountable for the patterns you create, the relationships you form, the growth you pursue. Death feels final only because you've been conditioned to perceive it that way. But Monroe's work offers a different lens. Death is the moment you stop pretending to be small. The body was never a cage. It was a lens. And when the lens shatters, the perceiver doesn't vanish. It simply sees more. You are not your thoughts. You are not your memories. You are not even your personality. You are the continuity of awareness that has moved through countless forms, countless lives, countless perspectives. And that continuity does not end. It shifts. It expands. It chooses its next focus. Monroe proved this not through belief, but through replicable experience. He didn't ask you to take his word for it. He built a protocol: enter the vibrational state, separate from the body, explore non-physical reality, return with verification. And thousands have followed that protocol, confirming the same core findings again and again. The invitation is simple. Don't wait for death to find out. Explore now, separate now, verify now, because the truth Monroe uncovered is not waiting for you on the other side. It's already here, humming beneath every breath you take. You've already died countless times in sleep, in deep meditation, in moments where your awareness drifted so far from physical sensation that the body became irrelevant. You just didn't recognize those experiences as practice runs for the final transition. But now you know, and knowing changes everything. Death is not the exit, it's the expansion. The body closes, awareness opens. You release the limiting mechanism and remember what you always were: vast, continuous, unbound by flesh or time or the gravitational pull of a single focal point. Monroe left you a map. The Monroe Institute continues his work, offering the same techniques, the same protocols, the same opportunity to verify for yourself that consciousness persists, that death is a frequency shift, that you are far more than the story you've been telling yourself about who and what you are. The only question left is whether you're willing to look, whether you're ready to release the fear that's been masking the truth your entire life, whether you'll take the step, not at death, but now, into the direct experience of your own continuity beyond physical form. Because once you do, you've left and returned even once, everything changes. Death stops being the ending. It becomes what it always was, the next chapter in a story that was never confined to a single book, a single life, a single body. You already know this. Deep down, beneath the conditioning, beneath the fear, beneath the rigid identification with physical form, you know you're more. You know you continue. You know death is not the end. Monroe just gave you permission to remember. Type in the comments, I understood it.